All right, chapter 15, Johnny got his gun. He kept on tapping. He kept on now for another reason aside from the simple desire to speak which had started him out. He kept on tapping because he didn't dare stop. He didn't dare think. He didn't have the courage to ask himself even so simple a question as how long will it be before the nurse understands what I am doing? Because he knew it might be months, it might be years, it might be all the rest of his life. All the rest of his life to be tapping when the merest whisper, one word with the syllables barely formed by two lips, when that was all he needed to tell what he wanted. There were times when he knew he was stark raving crazy, only from the outside he realized he must seem as he always had seemed. Anyone looking down at him would have no way of suspecting that beneath the mask and the mucus there lay insanity, as naked and cruel and desperate as insanity. There lay insanity as naked and cruel and desperate as insanity could ever be. He understood insanity. He knew all about it now. He understood the overpowering impulse to kill without having a reason for killing, the desire to beat against living skulls until they were the pulp, the passion to strangle the lust for murder that was more beautiful, more satisfying, more imperative than any lust he had known before. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't kill. He couldn't do anything but tap. Inside his skull there was a normal man with arms and legs and everything that goes with them. It was he, Joe Bonham, trapped in the darkness of his own skull, rushing frantically from earhole to earhole, wherever in the skull there might be an opening. Like a wild animal, he was trying to hammer his way out to escape into the world beyond. He was trapped in his own brain, tangled in the tissues and brain matter, kicking and gouging and screaming to get out, and the only person in the world who could help him had no idea of what he was doing. He got to thinking, this nurse is keeping me a prisoner. She's keeping me more securely a prisoner than any jailer, than any chain, than any stone wall they could ever build around me. He got to thinking of all the prisoners he had ever read about or heard about, all the little guys from the beginning of the doing of things who had been caught and imprisoned and who had died without ever becoming free again. He thought of the slaves, little guys like himself who had been captured in war, who had spent the rest of their lives chained like animals to oars, rowing some big guy's ship through the Mediterranean Sea. He thought of them down there in the deeps of the ship, never knowing where they were and going, never knowing where they were going, never smelling the outer air, never feeling anything except the oar in their hands and the shackles on their legs and the whip that lashed their backs when they grew tired. He thought of them all, the shepherds and farmers and clerks and little shopkeepers who had suddenly been taken away from their way of living, who had been cast into the ships and had stayed there away from their homes and their families and their native parts until finally they collapsed at their oars and died and were thrown out into the sea for the first time to touch fresh air and clean water. He thought of them and he thought they were luckier than I am. They could move, they could see each other, they were more nearly living than I, and they were not in prison as securely. He thought of the slaves deep under the street levels of Carthage before the Romans came and destroyed the city. He remembered from some time way back in the past how we had read of the Carthaginian slaves and what they did and how they were treated, how the great Carthaginian lords, wanting someone to guard their treasure stores, would find a healthy young man and put out his eyes with sharp sticks so he wouldn't be able to see where they took him, and thus learn the location of their treasures. Then they would take him, poor blinded young guy, down into the passages under the level of the streets to the door of the treasure house. There they chained one arm and one leg to the door, and one arm and one leg to the wall, so that for anyone to enter the seal would have to be broken, and the seal was the living, breathing body of a man. He thought of the Carthaginian slaves down in the darkness, blinded and chained, and he thought they were lucky guys. They died soon. There was no one there to take care of them, to make sure the breath of life stayed in their bodies as long as possible. They were in agony, but they died soon, and even in their agony they could stand on two legs, they could pull against their chains, they could hear, and when someone spoke, some great noble coming down into the treasure house, they could hear the blessed sound of a human voice. He thought of the slaves who built the pyramids, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, spanning their whole lives to put up a dead monument to a dead king. He thought of the slaves who fought each other in the Colosseum in Rome for the entertainment of big guys who sat in the boxes and held their thumbs up or down to give the slaves life or death. He thought of the slaves when they disobeyed. Ears lopped off, hands hacked away, screaming tongues flexed with cries for mercy, even as they were pulled out by the roots so that no secrets would be betrayed. Little guys all over the world shot, drowned, stabbed, crucified, boiled in oil, whipped to death, burned at the stake. All these things were the fate of slaves, the fate of the little guy, the fate of men like himself. Only the slaves could always die, but he couldn't, and he was mutilated far beyond any slave who ever lived. Yet he was one of them, he was part of them, he too was a slave. He too had been taken away from his home, he too had been put into the service of another without his consent. He too had been sent to a foreign country far from his native parts. He too had been forced to fight against other slaves of his own kind in a strange place. He too had been mutilated and branded forever. He too was at last a prisoner in the narrowest cell of them all, the cell of his own horrible body, awaiting only the relief of death. God help us, he thought. God help us all, the slaves. For hundreds and thousands of years we have been tapping, we slaves tapping away from the depths of our prisons. All of us, all of the little guys, all the slaves from the beginning of time, tapping, tapping, tapping. A man had come into the room, a man with heavy footsteps. The man came over to the bed and threw the covers back and began to prod his body. It was the doctor. He could imagine the nurse going for the doctor and saying, "That thing up there in the room, that thing is always tapping its head. I get nervous, I think it needs something. Come and look at it, come and try to stop its tapping." So the doctor had come, and now he was prodding him. When the prodding was over, the doctor took the tube from his throat, and he had a little fit of strangling like he always had when they took the tube out to clean it. The doctor put the tube back in its hole and stood quietly doing nothing. All during this, he kept up his tapping, and now that the doctor was quiet, he tapped much harder. It was just possible that the doctor might understand what he was trying to do. He felt the vibration of the doctor's footsteps moving over toward the dresser, then coming back again. He felt a cold, wet thing against the stump of his left arm. Then he felt a sharp little sting, a sharp little pain like a needle, and he knew the doctor was injecting something into his arm. Before he began to feel its effects, he knew it was some kind of dope. They were trying to shut him up. They had been trying all along. They knew perfectly well what he was doing. Nobody with any brains could fail to know. And he knew what they were doing too. They were plotting against him out there in the darkness. They had tried every way on earth to make him be still, but he had outfought them. He had kept right on tapping. So now they were doping him. They were forcing him to be silent. They didn't want to hear him. They weren't interested in anything but getting him off their minds. He shook his head frantically to try to tell him that he didn't want to be doped. Then the needle was withdrawn, and he knew it didn't matter whether he wanted it or not. He determined to keep on with his tapping in spite of them, to try to strengthen his will to such a point that even as the drug overcame him, even as he fell completely asleep from its effects, the strength of his will would carry over into his sleep, and he would continue the tapping just as you turn on a machine and it continues to operate after you have gone away. But a fog settled down over his mind. A numbness took possession of his flesh, so that it seemed that each time he lifted his head from the pillow, he was lifting some enormous weight. The weight grew heavier, the tapping grew slower, his flesh became like the flesh of a dead person. His mind seemed to shrink and shrivel as a drowsiness swept over it. In his last moment of thinking, he was saying to himself, "They've won again, but they can't win forever. They can't forever. Oh no, not forever." Peace.